July 20th, 1923. Mid-morning on a dusty street in Parral, Mexico. A Dodge touring car slows as it approaches an intersection. Behind the wheel sits a 45-year-old man who, just 3 years earlier, commanded the most powerful revolutionary army in Mexico. A man who had forced the President of the United States to send 10,000 troops into Mexico on a manhunt that failed spectacularly. A man who had signed movie contracts with Hollywood, who appeared on newspaper front pages worldwide, who transformed from illiterate farm boy to outlaw, to general, to legend. As the car turns the corner, a street vendor raises his hand in an unusual signal. 9 assassins hidden in a nearby building open fire with 40 rounds. When the shooting stops, Pancho Villa, the centaur of the North, Robin Hood of Mexico, hero to millions of peasants, slumps forward, his revolutionary journey ending in a hail of bullets arranged by the very government he'd helped create. But here's the mystery. 3 years later, someone breaks into his tomb and steals his head. To this day, nobody knows who took it or why. This is the story of how a boy who couldn't read or write became one of the 20th century's most fascinating revolutionaries. A man whose life was so extraordinary that even his death couldn't contain the legend. Before we can understand Pancho Villa, we need to understand the world that created him. Because Villa wasn't born from comfortable circumstances, deciding to rebel for abstract political principles. He was forged by one of the most oppressive economic systems in the Western Hemisphere, the Mexican hacienda system of the late 19th century. Without understanding this system's brutality and how it shaped millions of Mexican lives, Villa's transformation from farm worker to outlaw to revolutionary makes no sense at all. Let's begin in 1878 in Durango State in north-central Mexico. The country is ruled by Porfirio Diaz, who will maintain power through dictatorship for 34 years. Diaz's Mexico is a study in extreme inequality, where a tiny elite owns vast estates, while the overwhelming majority of Mexicans own nothing and live in conditions approaching serfdom. This isn't feudalism exactly. Mexico is technically a modern republic, but the practical reality for most rural Mexicans is worse than what European peasants experienced in medieval times. The hacienda system dominated rural Mexico. Haciendas were enormous estates, sometimes covering hundreds of thousands of acres, owned by wealthy families who'd accumulated land through various means over centuries. These estates weren't just farms. They were complete economic and social worlds where the owner, the hacendado, exercised nearly absolute power over everyone living within their boundaries. The workers, called peones, were technically free laborers, but practically trapped by debt peonage, a system that kept them perpetually owing money to the estate and therefore unable to leave. How did debt peonage work? The hacienda would pay workers tiny wages, but require them to buy food, tools, clothing, and other necessities from the hacienda's own store at inflated prices. Workers inevitably spent more than they earned, accumulating debt. Mexican law forbade anyone with debts from leaving their employment until those debts were paid. Since the debts could never be paid on the wages the hacienda provided, workers were effectively imprisoned. When a worker died, their children inherited the debt, creating multi-generational bondage where families remained trapped on the same hacienda for a century or more. Life on these estates was harsh beyond what most modern people can easily imagine. Workers lived in primitive housing, often just single rooms housing entire families. They worked from sunrise to sunset 6 or 7 days per week. They received minimal food, mostly corn and beans, insufficient for proper nutrition. Medical care was non-existent or rudimentary. Education was forbidden. Hacendados believed that literate workers were dangerous workers, more likely to organize or demand rights. Children began working as young as 6 or 7, helping in fields or performing simpler tasks, their childhood sacrificed to the estate's productivity. The hacendados and their families, by contrast, lived in extraordinary luxury. The main hacienda house was often a mansion rivaling European estates, filled with imported furniture, fine art, extensive libraries. The owners traveled to Mexico City or even Europe regularly, educating their children in the best schools, participating in high society. This stark contrast, palatial wealth surrounded by desperate poverty, created obvious tensions, but those tensions were managed through violence and intimidation. Workers who complained too loudly might be beaten. Workers who tried to organize were killed. Local police and even federal troops supported the hacendados, because those wealthy families controlled the political system through their money and influence. Into this world, on June 5, 1878, a baby boy was born to Agustin Arango and Micaela Arambula, poor workers on the hacienda of Rio Grande in Durango. They named him Doroteo Arango. His parents were peones, trapped by debt, working land they'd never own, living at the mercy of an owner they'd never challenge. Doroteo was the oldest of 5 children, and from his earliest memories, he would have understood his family's precarious position, would have seen the suffering around him, would have learned that the world was fundamentally divided between those who owned and those who served. His father died when Doroteo was young. Sources disagree on exactly when, perhaps when the boy was in his early teens. This death would have been economically catastrophic for the family. Agustin's wages, minimal as they were, had been their survival. His death left a widow and 5 children with no income and increasing debt. Doroteo, as the oldest son, would have been expected to take over his father's obligations, to work the same fields, accumulate the same debts, follow the same path to nowhere that had consumed his father's life. He received almost no formal education. Some accounts suggest he had a few months of schooling where he learned basic literacy, but most historians believe he remained essentially illiterate throughout his life, signing documents with an X or a simple mark. This wasn't unusual. Most hacienda workers were illiterate because education wasn't provided and literacy wasn't useful for the work they did. What Doroteo learned instead were practical skills: how to work in fields, how to handle horses and cattle, how to endure heat and exhaustion, how to make himself useful enough that the hacienda would continue employing his family despite their growing debt. But he also learned other lessons that the hacendados wouldn't have wanted him to learn. He learned that the system was fundamentally unjust, that hard work brought no reward, that his family's suffering served only to make wealthy people wealthier. He learned that authorities, police, judges, local officials, served the rich and ignored the poor. He learned that the law, which supposedly protected everyone equally, actually protected only those with money and power, while providing no protection at all to people like his family. These lessons would shape everything that came after. The breaking point, the moment that transformed Doroteo Arango from hacienda worker to outlaw, came when he was 16 years old in 1894. The exact details are disputed and have been embellished over time, but the essential story is consistent across different accounts. The hacienda owner, or his son, sources vary on exactly who, assaulted or attempted to assault Doroteo's younger sister. Different versions describe this as rape, attempted rape, or sexual harassment, but all agree that someone with power targeted a vulnerable young woman because he could, because hacienda owners and their families believed they had rights over the workers' bodies as well as their labor. Doroteo responded with violence. He found a weapon. Some accounts say a pistol he stole or borrowed, others say a knife, and confronted his sister's attacker. Whether he injured or threatened the man varies by telling, But the result was clear. Doroteo had attacked someone far above his social station, had challenged the fundamental order that kept the hacienda system functioning. There would be no forgiveness, no understanding, no consideration of what provoked his actions. The hacienda's response would be swift and severe, probably execution, certainly imprisonment and beatings that would leave him permanently damaged if he survived. So Doroteo ran. He fled into the mountains of Durango, into the Sierra Madre, into regions where the hacienda's authority weakened and where a young man with courage and desperation might survive as an outlaw rather than die as a prisoner. He was 16 years old, illiterate, trained only for agricultural labor, with no resources except his own determination. Everything he would become started from this moment of flight, from being a victim of the hacienda system to becoming someone who would eventually help destroy that system entirely. This flight wasn't just personal escape. It represented something larger that was happening across Mexico in the late 19th century. Thousands of young men were being driven from their homes by the hacienda system's oppression, becoming outlaws not because they were inherently criminal, but because the social order gave them no legitimate way to survive with dignity. These men formed bandit groups throughout rural Mexico, robbing, stealing cattle, evading authorities, creating a permanent state of low-level conflict between the landed elite and the dispossessed poor. The Mexican government and wealthy landowners viewed these outlaws as simple criminals, threats to order and property that needed to be eliminated. But many rural Mexicans viewed them differently, as rebels against an unjust system, as heroes who took from the rich, even if they couldn't give much to the poor, as symbols that resistance was possible. This dual reputation, criminal to the elite, hero to the masses, would follow Doroteo Arango throughout his transformation into Pancho Villa and beyond. As he disappeared into the mountains in 1894, the boy who would become Pancho Villa was just beginning his education in a different kind of life. He would spend the next 16 years as an outlaw, learning survival skills, building networks, developing the leadership qualities and tactical abilities that would eventually make him one of Mexico's most formidable military commanders. But he was also, in those outlaw years, learning the most important lesson of all, that the Mexico he'd been born into was fundamentally broken, that millions of people suffered under a system that served only the wealthy few, and that changing that system would require revolutionary violence on a scale Mexico had never seen. The farm boy was gone. The outlaw had been born. And from that outlaw, a revolutionary would eventually emerge. The teenage boy who fled into the Sierra Madre in 1894 was named Doroteo Arango. The man who emerged from those mountains years later was Pancho Villa. The transformation involved more than just a name change. It represented the forging of a completely different person, someone harder, more capable, more dangerous, and ultimately more significant than the hacienda worker could ever have imagined becoming. To understand this transformation, we need to understand what outlaw life in turn-of-the-century Mexico actually meant, because it was simultaneously brutal and educational, isolating and communal, criminal and surprisingly political. First, the name change. Why did Doroteo Arango become Francisco Pancho Villa? The most commonly accepted explanation is that he took the name from either a bandit leader he joined or admired, or from a relative, adopting it to protect his original identity and to create distance from his past. In outlaw culture, name changes were common. They made it harder for authorities to track individuals, protected families from retaliation, and allowed people to reinvent themselves completely. Pancho is a common nickname for Francisco, making it accessible and memorable. The name Villa had respectable connotations, suggesting some status or property ownership. So Pancho Villa created an identity that was simultaneously common enough to blend in and distinctive enough to be memorable. But the name change represented something deeper than practical concealment. It marked a psychological break from his past. Doroteo Arango was a victim, a powerless farm worker whose sister had been targeted and who'd fled in desperate self-preservation. Pancho Villa would be something else, an agent rather than a victim, someone who took what he wanted rather than accepting what he was given, someone who made others afraid rather than living in fear himself. This reimagining of identity, from passive sufferer to active rebel, was crucial for psychological survival in outlaw life. The mountains that Villa fled into were harsh terrain, the Sierra Madre Occidental running roughly parallel to Mexico's western coast through states including Durango, Chihuahua, and Sonora. This was rough country with dramatic elevation changes, deep canyons, dense forests in some areas, and barren rock in others, extreme temperature variations between day and night. It was difficult terrain for authorities to patrol, which made it ideal for outlaws, but also difficult for outlaws themselves to survive in. Water sources were scattered, food was scarce unless you knew how to hunt or where to forage, and exposure could kill you if you weren't careful. Villa joined existing bandit groups operating in these mountains. Banditry was endemic in Porfirio Diaz's Mexico, a direct result of the economic oppression that created desperately poor populations with no legal prospects for improvement. Some bandit groups were purely criminal, focused entirely on profit through robbery and cattle theft. Others had more complex motivations, targeting specifically the wealthy and powerful, while avoiding or even helping poor Mexicans. Villa seems to have gravitated toward the latter type, though whether from principle or practicality is debatable. Helping poor communities created networks of support that made survival easier. The practical activities of banditry were straightforward but dangerous. Cattle rustling was a primary occupation, stealing cattle from haciendas and selling them in different regions or across the US border. This was lucrative because cattle were valuable, relatively easy to move long distances, and difficult to identify definitely once brands were altered. Highway robbery was another occupation, stopping travelers, especially merchants or wealthy individuals, and taking money and goods. Occasionally, bandits would raid haciendas directly, taking money, weapons, horses, supplies. All of this was extremely risky because being caught meant summary execution or imprisonment so brutal that death might be preferable. Villa became skilled at these activities through experience and natural aptitude. He developed exceptional horsemanship, essential for covering long distances quickly, for escaping pursuers, for the mobility that allowed small bandit groups to operate against much larger forces. He learned to read terrain, to find water sources, to identify good camping spots that provided protection and escape routes. He learned to assess people quickly, who could be trusted, who might betray the group, which merchants would cooperate quietly, and which would resist and need to be intimidated. These were life and death skills developed through practice, where mistakes could be fatal. But he also developed leadership qualities that would prove crucial later. Bandit groups were inherently unstable, men with violent skills, no legal constraints, and conflicting interests, working together under stress. Keeping such groups functional required leadership ability that combined charisma, ruthlessness, fairness, and tactical intelligence. Villa apparently possessed these qualities naturally or developed them quickly. Stories from this period, though often exaggerated or invented, consistently portray him as emerging into leadership roles, as someone other bandits followed, not just from fear, but from respect for his abilities and his fairness in distributing stolen goods. The relationship between bandits and rural communities was complex and crucial. Bandits needed food, shelter, information about troop movements, places to hide when pursued. Rural communities could provide these things or refuse them. The decision typically depended on how bandits treated those communities. Bandits who robbed from everyone, including poor farmers, found no support and usually were captured or killed quickly. Bandits who focused on wealthy targets, while leaving poor communities alone or even sharing stolen goods with them, developed networks of support that made them nearly impossible for authorities to catch. Villa, according to the legend that emerged around him, understood this dynamic and cultivated popular support consciously. Stories from this period describe him giving money or goods to poor families, paying for meals rather than simply taking them, helping communities in small ways that created loyalty and obligation. Whether he did this from genuine sympathy for poor Mexicans or from calculated self-interest is impossible to determine. Probably both motivations operated simultaneously. What matters is that he built networks of support throughout northern Mexico that would prove invaluable when he later transitioned from outlaw to revolutionary. The authorities pursuing bandits were varied and generally ineffective. Local police were sparse, poorly trained, poorly paid, and often corrupt. Rural police, the rurales, were more formidable, a paramilitary force that Porfirio Diaz created specifically to combat banditry and maintain order in rural areas. The rurales were recruited from former bandits and soldiers, paid better than regular police, and given considerable freedom to use violence. They were effective to a degree, but also hated by rural populations because they represented federal authority backing the hacienda system. Villa survived multiple encounters with rurales and other authorities during his outlaw years. He developed the evasion skills and tactical instincts that would later serve him as a military commander. He learned how government forces operated, their strengths, their weaknesses, their predictable patterns. He learned that superior numbers didn't always win if smaller forces used terrain cleverly and struck unexpectedly. He learned that authorities were often poorly motivated, their soldiers and police seeing service as just employment rather than a cause worth risking their lives for, which meant they could be intimidated or evaded by bandits who were fighting for survival. During these years, Villa also developed his understanding of Mexico's political situation. Outlaw camps were gathering places for men with grievances, places where political discussions happened alongside practical planning. Villa, though illiterate, wasn't unintelligent. He absorbed information through conversations, developed his own analysis of why Mexico's social system produced so much poverty and banditry, began thinking about what changes might improve conditions for poor Mexicans. These weren't abstract academic discussions, but practical analyses by men whose lives had been destroyed by the existing system and who had direct experience with its injustices. By the early 1900s, Villa had been an outlaw for nearly a decade. He'd survived when many others died. He'd built networks and reputation. He'd developed military skills, leadership abilities, and political understanding. He transformed from a terrified 16-year-old fleeing violence into a 30-year-old outlaw with considerable capabilities and connections. But he was still just a bandit, operating on Mexico's margins, surviving, but not affecting the larger society that had driven him into outlawry. That would change dramatically in 1910, when Francisco Madero launched the revolution that would overthrow Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship. The revolution would give Villa and thousands of men like him an opportunity to transform from outlaws into revolutionary soldiers, to redirect their skills and anger toward changing the system rather than just surviving within it. The outlaw years were Villa's education. The revolutionary years would be his masterpiece. But before any of that could happen, before he could become the centaur of the North, commanding armies and reshaping Mexico's future, he had to make the transition from bandit to revolutionary. From fighting for personal survival to fighting for something larger than himself. That transition, like so much of Villa's life, would be dramatic, violent, and ultimately world-changing in ways that nobody, including Villa himself, could have predicted when it began. November 20th, 1910. Throughout Mexico, scattered groups of armed men rise against the government in what will become known as the Mexican Revolution. This wasn't a unified uprising with central command, but a fragmented rebellion where different leaders with different motivations challenged Porfirio Díaz's three-decade dictatorship. In northern Mexico, one of those leaders was Francisco Madero, an unlikely revolutionary from a wealthy family who believed that democracy and constitutional reform could transform Mexico. And among the men Madero attracted to his cause was a 32-year-old outlaw named Pancho Villa, who was about to begin his transformation from bandit to revolutionary general. To understand why Villa joined the revolution, we need to understand the political moment. Porfirio Díaz had ruled Mexico since 1876, maintaining power through a combination of political manipulation, economic modernization, and brutal suppression of opposition. His government brought railroads, foreign investment, and industrial development to Mexico, creating impressive economic statistics that made Mexico look successful by contemporary measures. But those benefits flowed almost entirely to wealthy Mexicans and foreign investors, while ordinary Mexicans, especially in rural areas, experienced increasing poverty and oppression. By 1910, political opposition to Díaz had been building for years. Francisco Madero, born into a wealthy northern Mexican family, had traveled abroad, absorbed democratic ideas, and returned convinced that Mexico needed political reform. In 1910, he ran against Díaz for president, a futile gesture since Díaz controlled the electoral process completely and was imprisoned for his audacity. Released and exiled to the United States, Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosi, calling for revolution beginning November 20th, 1910. His platform was moderate by revolutionary standards. He wanted fair elections, constitutional rule, limited land reform. He wasn't calling for radical social transformation, but for gradual democratic improvement. This moderation might seem unlikely to appeal to someone like Pancho Villa, whose grievances against Mexican society were far more fundamental than concerns about electoral fairness. But Madero's revolution created opportunities that transcended his specific platform. It offered a chance to fight the system that had oppressed Villa and millions like him, to use military skills developed through banditry for something that felt larger and more legitimate. It promised that if the revolution succeeded, the power relationships that had kept poor Mexicans trapped might fundamentally change. And, perhaps most practically, it offered amnesty. Successful revolutionaries wouldn't be punished for past crimes, meaning Villa could emerge from outlawry into legitimate society if the revolution won. Villa's initial recruitment into the revolution came through Abraham González, one of Madero's key supporters in Chihuahua state. González was himself from a relatively privileged background, but genuinely believed in social reform. He recognized that the revolution needed fighters, especially fighters with military skills and knowledge of northern Mexico's terrain. He also understood that men like Villa, with established networks among rural communities and experience in irregular warfare, were exactly what the revolutionary cause needed. So he sought Villa out, explained the revolution's goals, and convinced him to join. This moment, when Villa agreed to fight for the revolution, marks a crucial psychological and social transformation. He was no longer just an outlaw seeking personal survival, but a revolutionary fighting for a cause. This legitimization mattered enormously, both to Villa personally and to how others perceived him. As an outlaw, he was a criminal, someone society wanted eliminated. As a revolutionary, he became a hero, someone fighting for justice and change. The same activities, raising armed groups, attacking government forces, seizing property from wealthy individuals, went from crimes to revolutionary actions, depending entirely on this frame. Villa's military talents became apparent almost immediately. He'd learned irregular warfare through a decade of banditry, how to move quickly, strike unexpectedly, use terrain advantages, live off the land, maintain mobility against larger forces. These were exactly the skills needed for revolutionary warfare, where small, poorly equipped groups fought against government forces with superior numbers and weapons. Villa wasn't a trained military officer in any formal sense. He'd never attended military academy or studied strategy academically, but he possessed natural tactical intelligence and intuitive understanding of irregular warfare that formal training often couldn't match. His first significant military success came at the Battle of Ciudad Juarez in May 1911. This border city, sitting directly across from El Paso, Texas, was strategically crucial. Taking it would give revolutionaries an international border crossing, access to US territory for supplies, and retreat if necessary, and symbolic significance as a major city. Villa commanded cavalry forces in the battle, leading charges that broke through government defensive positions and contributed significantly to the revolutionary victory. The city fell, Madero entered triumphantly, and Villa emerged as one of the revolution's most effective commanders. But Villa's relationship with formal military hierarchy was complicated from the beginning. He was a superb tactical commander with deep understanding of irregular warfare, but he lacked formal education, couldn't read or write, and didn't fit easily into conventional military structures. He was impatient with military formalities, preferred direct action over elaborate planning, and relied on personal charisma to command, rather than on formal authority. This made him effective, but also difficult for more conventionally minded officers to work with or control. Ciudad Juarez's victory led to negotiations between Diaz and Madero. Remarkably, given how such conflicts usually end, Diaz agreed to resign and go into exile, rather than fight to the death. This relatively peaceful transition seemed to validate Madero's moderate approach. Revolution could produce change without prolonged violence or social collapse. Elections were held, Madero won the presidency, and Mexico appeared to be transitioning toward democracy. The revolution seemed to have succeeded. But this apparent success disguised deeper problems. Madero's moderate reforms didn't address the fundamental issues that had driven men like Villa into outlawry and then into revolution. The hacienda system remained largely intact, with wealthy landowners retaining their estates and power. Land redistribution, which many revolutionaries, including Villa, believed was essential, proceeded slowly and incompletely. The army that had served Diaz remained in place, with many officers hostile to the revolution and to Madero personally. Political instability persisted as different factions maneuvered for position. Villa, like many revolutionaries, found the post-revolutionary situation frustrating. He'd fought expecting fundamental change, expecting that the revolution would break the power of the wealthy elite and redistribute land to peasants. Instead, change came slowly and incompletely, if at all. Madero, whom Villa admired personally, seemed constrained by political considerations that Villa didn't fully understand or respect. The revolution had succeeded in overthrowing Diaz, but hadn't yet transformed Mexican society in the ways Villa believed necessary. Tensions between Villa and formal military authority erupted dramatically in 1912. General Victoriano Huerta, a career military officer who'd fought for Diaz but now served Madero's government, commanded federal forces fighting remaining rebels in northern Mexico. Huerta represented everything Villa disliked about formal military culture: rigid hierarchy, contempt for irregular fighters, loyalty to military institutions rather than revolutionary ideals. The two men clashed repeatedly, with Huerta resenting Villa's independence and Villa resenting Huerta's authority. The conflict culminated when Huerta had Villa arrested on dubious charges and ordered his execution. Villa, the revolutionary hero who'd contributed significantly to Madero's victory, was going to be shot without proper trial based on accusations from an officer he'd angered. He was literally standing before a firing squad when a last-minute telegram from Madero arrived, countermanding the execution order and demanding Villa be given a proper trial. Villa was spared but imprisoned, spending months in jail, while his case was supposedly processed through military legal systems. This near execution and subsequent imprisonment taught Villa crucial lessons about revolutionary politics. Personal courage and military success didn't guarantee protection. Formal power structures and political connections mattered enormously. Madero, whom Villa genuinely admired, had saved his life, but only after allowing him to reach the point where salvation required last-minute intervention. The revolution Villa had joined, believing it would fundamentally transform Mexico, was being absorbed into familiar patterns where formal authority and traditional power structures reasserted themselves. If Villa wanted to ensure the revolution achieved what he believed it promised, he needed more than just tactical military skills. He needed political understanding and independent power. While imprisoned, Villa took an extraordinary step for an illiterate 34-year-old. He learned to read. Another prisoner, Bernardo Reyes, taught him basic literacy during their months together. This education was limited. Villa never became fluent in written Spanish, continued signing most documents with an X or simple mark throughout his life. But it represented an enormous personal achievement and demonstrated Villa's intelligence and determination. Here was a man who could have spent his imprisonment passively, instead choosing to acquire skills that would make him more effective after release. He eventually escaped from prison in December 1912, fleeing to El Paso, Texas, and entering a period of exile, while Madero's government continued struggling with instability and opposition. Villa watched from across the border as Mexico descended further into chaos, as Huerta, the same general who tried to have Villa executed, betrayed and overthrew Madero in February 1913, murdering him along with Vice President José María Pino Suárez. This betrayal, this destruction of the moderate democratic revolution Villa had fought for, convinced Villa that half measures wouldn't work. If Mexico was going to change fundamentally, it would require more radical revolution, more determined fighting, more willingness to destroy the old order completely rather than trying to reform it gradually. In March 1913, Villa crossed back into Mexico with 8 men. 8. Not an army, not even a significant band, just 8 men crossing into a country in chaos where thousands of government troops would be hunting them. But Villa believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that he could build an army again, that the revolutionary cause wasn't dead despite Madero's murder, that northern Mexico's peasants would rally to him if he provided leadership. This moment, crossing the border with almost no resources or support, demonstrated either extraordinary courage or reckless overconfidence, or both. What it definitely demonstrated was that Villa was committed completely to the revolutionary cause, willing to risk everything for the possibility of transforming Mexico into something better than the oppressive society that had forced him into outlawry 20 years earlier. The outlaw was returning. The revolutionary general was emerging. And the División del Norte, the army of the North that would make Pancho Villa famous throughout the world, was about to be born. When Pancho Villa crossed back into Mexico in March 1913 with just 8 companions, building an army capable of fighting the federal government seemed absurdly ambitious. The government commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, modern weapons purchased from abroad, railroads for rapid troop movement, the entire infrastructure of state power. Villa had 8 men, whatever weapons they could carry, and the support of peasant communities that were sympathetic but poor, lacking resources to contribute to revolutionary warfare. Yet within months, Villa would command thousands of fighters. Within a year, his División del Norte would be the most powerful military force in Mexico. Understanding how he achieved this remarkable feat teaches us about leadership, irregular warfare, social movements, and why revolutions succeed or fail. The foundation of Villa's military success was the profound alienation of northern Mexico's rural population from the government. Huerta's coup and Madero's murder had destroyed whatever legitimacy the Mexican government possessed among people who'd hoped the revolution would improve their lives. Huerta represented exactly what the revolution had fought against: military dictatorship, service to wealthy interests, contempt for ordinary Mexicans. His government offered nothing to peasants except continued oppression and demands for taxes and military conscription. So when Villa appeared, offering an alternative, offering to fight Huerta, and promising that this time the revolution would truly change things, thousands of men were ready to join him. Villa's recruiting approach was personal and direct. He would enter villages, explain his goals, emphasize his own origins as a poor worker who understood peasants' suffering, promise that fighting for his army would lead to real change. He didn't coerce or kidnap recruits. He didn't need to because volunteers came willingly. These weren't professional soldiers seeking employment, but farmers and workers becoming revolutionaries, men who believed Villa when he promised that overthrowing Huerta would lead to land redistribution, education for their children, escape from debt peonage, and fundamental transformation of Mexican society. But enthusiasm alone doesn't create effective armies. Villa understood that revolutionary fervor needed to be combined with discipline, training, and tactical intelligence. The División del Norte developed strict regulations that distinguished it from typical revolutionary bands. Villa prohibited his soldiers from looting civilian property. Food and supplies would be taken from captured federal stores or purchased from sympathetic communities, not stolen from ordinary people. He banned alcohol among troops when they were near combat, recognizing that drunk soldiers were ineffective soldiers. He established severe punishments, including execution, for rape or assault against civilians, understanding that maintaining popular support required protecting the very people the revolution claimed to serve. This discipline was unusual in revolutionary warfare and gave Villa's forces enormous advantages. Federal troops and other revolutionary bands often treated civilian populations as resources to be exploited, taking food, animals, possessions, sometimes treating civilians brutally just because they could. This created resentment that undermined support for those forces. Villa's relatively respectful treatment of civilians meant that as his army moved through northern Mexico, communities welcomed them, provided intelligence about federal troop movements, offered shelter and supplies willingly rather than resentfully. This popular support made Villa's forces far more effective than their numbers alone would suggest. Villa's tactical approach emphasized mobility and shock. The División del Norte was primarily cavalry, horsemen who could cover enormous distances quickly, appear unexpectedly, strike hard, and disappear before federal forces could respond effectively. This mobility was crucial in northern Mexico's vast terrain, where distances between towns and cities were enormous, and where federal forces couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. Villa would concentrate his forces against isolated federal garrisons, overwhelming them through surprise and superior numbers at the point of attack, then dispersing or moving before federal reinforcements arrived. He also revolutionized Mexican warfare by using railroads systematically. Federal forces used trains for troop movement, but Villa used them far more creatively. The División del Norte would capture trains, use them to move troops and supplies rapidly across hundreds of miles, even convert cars into mobile hospitals and supply depots. In some battles, Villa's forces would arrive by train, catching federal commanders completely by surprise, because they hadn't expected an army to appear so quickly, so far from where it had been reported days earlier. This railroad strategy gave Villa mobility that compensated for his lack of artillery and other heavy equipment that federal forces possessed but couldn't move quickly. The División del Norte grew rapidly through victories and reputation. Success attracted recruits. Men wanted to join a winning army, especially one that treated its soldiers relatively well and appeared to be fighting for a genuine cause rather than just seeking power. By late 1913, Villa commanded several thousand fighters. By mid-1914, perhaps 20 to 30,000, making the División del Norte comparable to federal forces and far larger than other revolutionary armies operating in different regions. Villa's relationship with his soldiers was complex and effective. He was personally courageous, leading charges rather than directing from safe distances, which earned soldiers respect and loyalty. He shared hardships with common soldiers, eating similar food and sleeping in similar conditions, rather than claiming special privileges that officers in conventional armies expected. He distributed captured money and supplies relatively equitably, ensuring that soldiers felt they were benefiting from victories rather than just enriching their commanders. This created personal loyalty that went beyond military discipline, making soldiers willing to risk their lives not just because they were ordered to, but because they genuinely believed in Villa and the cause he represented. But Villa could also be ruthless when necessary. He executed soldiers who violated his regulations against looting or assault. He showed no mercy to captured federal officers, often having them shot immediately, believing that professional soldiers who'd served dictators deserved no consideration. He burned haciendas belonging to owners who'd supported Huerta or opposed the revolution, redistributing land to peasants in acts that were simultaneously revolutionary and vengeful. This combination of accessibility and ruthlessness made Villa frightening to enemies while beloved by supporters, an essential combination for revolutionary leadership. His major victories in 1913 and 1914 demonstrated the División del Norte's increasing capability. The capture of Ciudad Juárez in November 1913 gave him control of a crucial border city and its customs revenues, providing funds for weapons and supplies. The Battle of Torreón in April 1914 was even more significant. A major city with strategic railways, defended by thousands of federal troops, taken after fierce fighting that demonstrated the División del Norte could defeat federal forces in direct combat, not just in guerrilla actions. The victory at Zacatecas in June 1914, won through coordinated attacks that broke through seemingly impregnable federal defenses, essentially destroyed Huerta's military capacity in northern Mexico. These victories had political consequences beyond their immediate military significance. Villa became internationally famous. American newspapers covered his campaigns extensively, often portraying him sympathetically as a colorful revolutionary fighting for land reform and social justice. Hollywood became interested, seeing commercial potential in filming real revolutionary warfare. And other revolutionary leaders, including Venustiano Carranza, who led the Constitutionalist faction, and Emiliano Zapata, who led peasant revolutionaries in southern Mexico, had to recognize Villa's military importance and political influence, whether they liked him personally or not. By August 1914, Huerta had been driven from power, fleeing into exile. The revolution appeared to have succeeded for a second time, But just as after Diaz's overthrow in 1911, success revealed underlying divisions among revolutionaries. Different leaders had fought Huerta for different reasons, with different visions for Mexico's future. Carranza, representing relatively moderate middle-class constitutionalism, wanted orderly government under laws that would limit presidential power but wouldn't fundamentally restructure Mexican society. Zapata wanted radical land reform that would destroy the hacienda system and redistribute land to peasant communities. Villa wanted, well, Villa's political vision was less clearly articulated, but it certainly included land reform, education, and destroying the power of the wealthy elite who'd oppressed poor Mexicans. These tensions exploded into open conflict among revolutionaries themselves. The period from 1914 to 1915 saw revolutionary factions fighting each other as bitterly as they'd fought federal forces. Villa initially allied with Zapata, the two peasant revolutionaries recognizing common cause despite their different regional bases. They opposed Carranza's more moderate vision, believing it would leave fundamental social structures intact and betray the revolution's promise to poor Mexicans. But Carranza controlled resources, had better international recognition, and commanded capable generals, including Álvaro Obregón, who would prove to be Villa's military superior in crucial battles. The División del Norte represented Villa's peak power, tens of thousands of soldiers, control over much of northern Mexico, international fame, and the genuine love of peasant communities who saw him as their champion. But building this force had been easier than maintaining it. The revolutionary coalition was fracturing. Powerful enemies were emerging from within the revolutionary movement itself, and Villa's military skills, while formidable in guerrilla warfare and mobile cavalry operations, would prove insufficient against the more conventional military tactics that Obregón employed. The División del Norte's greatest victories were behind it. The hardest defeats lay ahead. But before those defeats came, Villa would enjoy a brief moment as perhaps the most famous Mexican in the world, a revolutionary whose name appeared in newspapers globally and whose image would soon appear in the newest of mass media, cinema. Imagine this, January 1914. A Hollywood film company signs a contract with an active revolutionary general, paying him $25,000, equivalent to over $700,000 today, for exclusive film rights to his battles. The general agrees to fight during daylight hours when possible, so cameras can record the action clearly. He'll stage reenactments when necessary. He even agrees to delay certain attacks if film crews aren't ready. This isn't fiction. This actually happened when Pancho Villa signed a contract with the Mutual Film Corporation, creating one of the most bizarre intersections of warfare, entertainment, and celebrity in modern history. To understand how this happened, we need to understand the cultural moment. By 1914, motion pictures were transitioning from novelty to major entertainment industry. Audiences craved spectacle, action, exotic locations, and dramatic stories. The Mexican Revolution provided all of these elements: real warfare, dramatic personalities, a foreign location accessible from the United States, and conflicts that Americans could follow through extensive newspaper coverage. Villa, specifically, had become famous through that coverage, portrayed often as a romantic revolutionary, a Robin Hood figure fighting for peasants against oppression. American audiences were fascinated by him. Film companies recognized commercial potential. The Mutual Film Corporation approached Villa through agents, proposing to document his revolutionary campaigns in exchange for payment that Villa could use to buy weapons and supplies for his army. For the film company, this was brilliant opportunism. Access to real warfare, cooperation from subjects rather than trying to film secretly or at risk, and connection to a personality who was already famous. For Villa, it was practical. He needed money, and if Hollywood would pay him for something he was going to do anyway, fight battles, Why not accept? The contract specified remarkable details. Mutual Film would have exclusive rights to film Villa and the División del Norte in action. Villa agreed to conduct battles during daylight when possible for better filming. Some sources claim he actually delayed attacks for camera crews, though this is probably exaggerated or applied only to minor skirmishes, not major battles where tactical considerations outweighed commercial ones. Villa would reenact scenes if actual battle footage was insufficient or unclear. He'd provide access to his camps and soldiers for additional filming. The resulting films would be distributed commercially, promoting Villa's image internationally while generating profits for the film company. This arrangement created surreal situations. Camera crews accompanied Villa's forces during campaigns, filming reconnaissance, march sequences, camp life, preparations for battle. During actual combat, cameramen would position themselves to capture action, sometimes at considerable personal risk. Bullets didn't distinguish between combatants and documentarians. When battles moved too quickly, or occurred in poor visibility, or when crews couldn't position cameras effectively, Villa would cooperate with reenactments afterward, his soldiers pretending to attack positions they'd already captured, staging cavalry charges that had occurred hours earlier. The resulting films had mixed authenticity. Some footage showed genuine combat, troops advancing, smoke from gunfire, casualties being carried away. Other scenes were clearly staged, too perfect in composition, repeated multiple times for different camera angles, featuring Villa prominently in situations where a commander actually directing battle wouldn't have been so visible. For audiences in 1914 who'd never seen combat footage, these distinctions didn't matter much. They were watching the Mexican Revolution as it happened, seeing Pancho Villa and his army in action, experiencing vicarious excitement from warfare that was simultaneously real and performed. Villa's motivation for accepting this arrangement went beyond just money. He understood, in his own way, that image and reputation mattered in revolutionary warfare. International support, or at least international sympathy, provided protection and legitimacy. American audiences who saw Villa in films as a romantic revolutionary fighting for justice would pressure their government to treat Villa respectfully, or at least not to intervene against him. Mexican audiences, particularly peasants who couldn't read newspapers but could watch films, would see Villa's power and success visually, encouraging them to support the revolution. The films were propaganda, but propaganda, Villa believed, would serve his cause. The arrangement also revealed Villa's personality and the contradictions within it. Here was a man who'd grown up illiterate on a hacienda, who'd spent years as an outlaw surviving through banditry, now negotiating contracts with Hollywood corporations and thinking strategically about mass media's power to shape public opinion. Villa was not the simple peasant revolutionary that some romantic accounts portrayed. He was politically sophisticated in practical ways, understanding instinctively what more educated theorists articulated in abstract terms: that modern warfare was fought in public imagination as much as on battlefields. American responses to Villa's Hollywood connection were mixed. Some Americans found it exciting and charming, the revolutionary who welcomed cameras, who seemed to understand modern publicity, who wasn't afraid of exposure. Others found it troubling or ridiculous. Shouldn't warfare be serious rather than entertainment? Wasn't there something inappropriate about treating revolutionary violence as commercial spectacle? Mexican elites and Villa's revolutionary rivals criticized it as vanity and showmanship, suggesting Villa cared more about fame than about genuine revolutionary transformation. But the films accomplished what Villa needed them to accomplish. They made him internationally famous. His image appeared not just in newspapers, but on movie screens throughout the United States, Europe, and beyond. Audiences worldwide knew his face, his name, his basic story. This fame provided some protection, Villa couldn't be eliminated quietly because too many people knew about him and would notice his disappearance. It also created problems that would emerge later, making him seem too visible, too confident, too connected to the United States at a time when anti-American nationalism was rising in Mexico. The Hollywood connection was part of Villa's broader relationship with the United States, which was complex and ultimately tragic. In 1913 and 1914, the United States generally supported constitutionalist revolutionaries, including Villa against Huerta. President Woodrow Wilson was personally hostile to Huerta, viewing him as a military dictator who'd seized power through murder. Wilson allowed arms sales to revolutionaries, turned a blind eye to recruiting and training operations in Texas, and even ordered American forces to occupy Veracruz in April 1914, an action that helped the revolutionaries by preventing Huerta from receiving weapons shipments from Europe. Villa cultivated American support actively. He protected American properties in areas he controlled, ensuring that American mining companies and ranchers weren't expropriated or threatened. He welcomed American journalists, giving interviews, allowing access to his camps, presenting himself as respectful toward the United States and appreciative of American sympathy for the revolution. He was careful not to appear anti-American, even as he fought for Mexican sovereignty and social transformation. But American support was contingent and strategic, not based on genuine commitment to Villa's revolutionary goals. The United States wanted stability in Mexico, wanted a government that would protect American investments, wanted to prevent European powers from gaining influence. Once Huerta was overthrown, American priorities shifted toward whichever revolutionary leader seemed most likely to create orderly government. That leader was Venustiano Carranza, not Pancho Villa. Carranza was more educated, more conventionally bourgeois, more committed to constitutional procedures that American officials understood and found reassuring. Villa was too radical, too unpredictable, too much the peasant revolutionary for American comfort. The withdrawal of American support would prove catastrophic for Villa. In October 1915, the United States formally recognized Carranza's government as Mexico's legitimate government, grant it diplomatic recognition and allowing it to import weapons while denying those same rights to Villa. This shift essentially ended Villa's chances of victory in the Revolutionary Civil War. His forces, already weakened by military defeats at Obregon's hands, now couldn't replenish weapons and ammunition. Carranza's forces, by contrast, received American support and grew stronger. Villa felt betrayed. He'd courted American favor, had protected American interests, had believed American support was genuine, only to discover it was purely pragmatic. This betrayal would lead directly to one of the most dramatic events in Villa's career and in United States-Mexico relations: the raid on Columbus, New Mexico, in March 1916, the first hostile attack on United States territory in the 20th century, and an action that would provoke an American military incursion into Mexico. But before we get to that dramatic confrontation, we need to understand Villa's peak moment, the period when he wasn't just a military commander, but a governor, an administrator, someone trying to implement the social reforms the revolution promised. Because Villa's time governing Chihuahua State revealed dimensions of his character and abilities that pure military history misses. He wasn't just a fighter. He was someone genuinely trying to transform Mexican society, someone whose vision for a better Mexico deserves recognition, even though his military defeats prevented that vision from being fully realized. December 1913. Pancho Villa, the former outlaw who'd spent years surviving in mountains and living outside all social structures, becomes governor of Chihuahua, one of Mexico's largest and wealthiest states. This wasn't a ceremonial position or brief symbolic gesture. Villa governed seriously for several months, implementing reforms that revealed aspects of his character and vision that military history often overlooks. Understanding Villa as administrator and reformer complicates the simple narrative of him as just a warrior, showing someone genuinely committed to transforming Mexican society, someone whose revolutionary goals went far beyond just winning battles. Chihuahua was strategically and economically crucial. The state controlled key railway connections between Mexico and the United States, contained productive agricultural lands and mining operations, and had significant population centers, including the state capital. Governing it effectively meant managing complex economic and social systems, not just commanding armies. Villa had no formal training for such responsibilities. He'd never held political office, had minimal education, knew nothing about bureaucratic administration or government finance. Yet he approached governance with the same energy and directness he brought to military command, implementing reforms rapidly and decisively. His first priority was education. Villa believed passionately that poverty persisted partly because poor Mexicans lacked education, that keeping people illiterate kept them powerless and exploitable. He'd experienced this personally. His own illiteracy had limited him throughout his life, and learning to read in prison had revealed what he'd been denied. So as governor, he launched an ambitious school building program, reportedly opening over 50 new schools in just the first few weeks of his administration. These weren't elaborate facilities, but functional buildings where children could learn to read, write, and do basic mathematics, skills that would give them opportunities their parents had never had. Funding these schools required money that Chihuahua's government didn't have through normal revenues. Villa found that money by expropriating property from wealthy individuals who'd supported Huerta or opposed the revolution. Large haciendas were seized, their lands either redistributed to peasant communities or managed by the state, with proceeds funding government programs. Wealthy families who'd accumulated fortunes through the old system suddenly found their property confiscated to pay for schools, hospitals, and support for war widows and orphans. This was revolutionary redistribution in its most direct form, taking from the rich and giving to the poor, not as metaphor, but as literal government policy. Villa also addressed food prices, which had risen dramatically due to warfare's disruptions of normal commerce. He imposed price controls on basic necessities, ensuring that ordinary people could afford food even when supplies were limited. He opened government stores that sold goods at controlled prices, competing with private merchants who Villa believed were exploiting shortages to charge excessive amounts. These measures were economically questionable. Price controls often create shortages and black markets, but they demonstrated Villa's commitment to protecting ordinary people from economic exploitation even during wartime. Perhaps most remarkably, Villa attempted to create his own currency. Revolutionary governments often face currency crises because existing money loses value when people doubt the government's stability and because financing warfare requires printing money that may exceed real economic productivity. Villa issued paper currency backed by his government's authority, attempting to maintain value through confidence in his administration and threats against anyone who refused to accept the money. This was economically naive in some ways. Currency value depends on complex factors, including international recognition and economic fundamentals that Villa couldn't control. But it showed him grappling seriously with governance challenges, rather than just ignoring economic realities. His governance style was personal and direct, reflecting his personality and limitations. Villa held public audiences where ordinary people could bring complaints or requests directly to him, bypassing bureaucratic intermediaries. This accessibility made him popular, but also made systematic administration difficult, governance by personal audience doesn't scale effectively. He made decisions quickly, sometimes impulsively, based on his understanding of situations that wasn't always complete. He trusted personal judgment over expertise, which sometimes worked well and sometimes produced problematic results. He showed little patience for bureaucratic procedures or legal formalities that he viewed as obstacles rather than necessary safeguards. His treatment of enemies and opponents revealed both his revolutionary commitment and his capacity for ruthlessness. Wealthy individuals who'd exploited workers under the old system faced expropriation of their property and sometimes imprisonment or exile. Officials from Huerta's administration who'd remained in Chihuahua were purged from government positions and sometimes punished more severely if Villa believed they'd committed particular injustices. Villa drew distinctions between ordinary soldiers who'd fought for Huerta because they were conscripted or needed employment. These men could be forgiven and even recruited into revolutionary forces, and officers and wealthy supporters who'd chosen to serve dictatorship. These faced much harsher treatment. Women played interesting roles in Villa's administration and in the División del Norte more broadly. The soldaderas, women who accompanied revolutionary armies, weren't just camp followers, but active participants who cooked, nursed wounded soldiers, carried supplies, and sometimes fought in combat. Villa's attitude toward these women was complex. He relied on their labor and occasionally their combat contributions, but also maintained fairly traditional views about gender roles and sometimes treated women paternalistically rather than as full equals. His governance included some attention to women's welfare, support for war widows, for example, but didn't challenge fundamental gender hierarchies in Mexican society. Villa's brief period as governor revealed both his strengths and limitations as a reformer. His strengths included genuine commitment to helping poor Mexicans, willingness to challenge wealthy elites aggressively, energy and determination in implementing programs quickly, and ability to inspire popular support through personal charisma and accessibility. His limitations included lack of formal education and administrative experience, impatience with systematic processes, tendency toward personalistic rather than institutional governance, and limited understanding of complex economic and political systems. The governorship ended when military priorities pulled Villa back to field command. Carranza and Villa were moving toward open conflict, and Villa needed to focus on military affairs rather than civil administration. His reforms in Chihuahua were partly reversed after he left. Property was returned to original owners, his currency lost value, some schools closed due to lack of funding, but the memory of his governorship remained important symbolically. Villa had demonstrated that revolutionary promises about land reform, education, and social transformation weren't just rhetoric, but could be actual policy when revolutionaries held power. This matters for understanding Villa's later career and legacy. When he raided Columbus or fought against Carranza, or eventually accepted retirement on a hacienda, critics portrayed him as power-hungry or unprincipled, or motivated by personal grievances rather than genuine revolutionary commitment. But his governorship suggests otherwise. He'd actually tried to implement reforms when given the chance, had used power to help poor people rather than just to enrich himself, had shown that his revolutionary rhetoric corresponded to actual policy goals. The tragedy is that military defeats prevented him from governing on larger scales or for longer periods, so we can only speculate about what Villa might have accomplished if the Revolutionary Civil War had ended differently. We should also consider how Villa's governorship looks in comparative perspective. Other revolutionary leaders who gained power, Carranza, Obregón, even Zapata in his southern territories, also faced challenges of transforming revolutionary promises into actual policy. All struggled with the gap between ideals and implementation, between what they wanted to accomplish and what circumstances permitted. Villa's challenges weren't unique to him, but but reflected broader difficulties inherent in revolutionary governance. How to fund programs without stable revenues, how to implement reforms without trained administrators, how to maintain military strength while also building civilian institutions, how to satisfy supporters' expectations while dealing with practical constraints. Villa's time as governor also complicates narratives about his supposed ignorance or lack of sophistication. Yes, he was illiterate or barely literate. Yes, he lacked formal education. But he understood intuitively what more educated revolutionaries articulated theoretically, that political power needed to serve poor people's material interests, that symbolic changes weren't enough without economic redistribution, that education was crucial for breaking cycles of poverty, that governance required challenging wealthy elites' power directly rather than just negotiating with them. His methods were sometimes crude and his understanding incomplete, but his basic analysis of what needed to change was arguably more radical and more accurate than the moderate constitutionalism that ultimately prevailed. The governorship represents Villa at his peak, not just militarily, but also politically. The moment when he had both military power and civil authority, when he could implement his vision rather than just fighting for it. Within months, everything would begin unraveling. Military defeats would weaken his forces. American support would shift to Carranza. The División del Norte would transform from revolutionary army to desperate guerrilla band. Villa would become increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate, ultimately making decisions, particularly the Columbus raid, that would destroy whatever remained of his political prospects and cement his international reputation as bandit rather than revolutionary. But before that collapse, there was this brief moment when Pancho Villa governed Chihuahua and tried to build the Mexico he'd been fighting for. Understanding that moment is essential for understanding who he really was. The period from mid-1914 through 1915 marked Pancho Villa's transformation from apparently unstoppable revolutionary leader to defeated guerrilla fighter. This reversal came primarily through military confrontations with Álvaro Obregón, a revolutionary general serving Venustiano Carranza, whose tactical innovations defeated Villa's cavalry-based warfare decisively. These defeats changed everything. Villa's political prospects, his relationship with the United States, and ultimately his place in history. And they led directly to the most controversial act of Villa's career, the raid on Columbus, New Mexico, in March 1916. An attack on United States territory that provoked an American military incursion into Mexico and transformed Villa from romantic revolutionary into international outlaw. Obregón represented a different kind of military leadership than Villa. Where Villa relied on mobility, personal courage, and irregular warfare tactics learned through banditry, Obregón brought systematic planning, defensive preparation, and willingness to use modern military technology in ways Villa either didn't understand or didn't have resources to implement. Obregón studied military history, learned from European warfare, including the early stages of World War I, and adapted those lessons to Mexican conditions. He understood that Villa's cavalry charges, while spectacular and effective against demoralized or poorly led opponents, were vulnerable to well-prepared defensive positions using modern weapons. The crucial battles came in April 1915 at Celaya, about 170 miles northwest of Mexico City. Obregón chose defensive positions carefully, using barbed wire extensively, something European armies had discovered was devastatingly effective against cavalry charges in the Boer War, and were proving again in World War I's trench warfare. When Villa's cavalry charged these positions with characteristic bravery, they were slaughtered. Machine guns and repeating rifles fired into massed horsemen created casualties on a scale Villa had never experienced. His tactical approach, which had worked brilliantly against Huerta's forces, proved completely inadequate against Obregon's defensive preparations. Villa tried repeatedly to break through, throwing his forces against Obregon's positions in multiple waves, believing that determination and courage would eventually prevail. This stubbornness, which some would call bravery and others would call foolish rigidity, cost the División del Norte thousands of casualties. The army that had been northern Mexico's most powerful force was bled white in a series of battles that demonstrated Obregon's tactical superiority conclusively. Villa retreated northward, his forces diminished, his reputation damaged, his political prospects severely compromised. These defeats had cascading consequences. Soldiers who joined Villa because he seemed destined to win now reconsidered their allegiances. Communities that had supported him because he appeared powerful now worried about Carranza's retaliation if they continued that support. International observers, including the United States government, re-evaluated who was likely to control Mexico's future. The momentum that had seemed to be carrying Villa toward national power reversed completely. By late 1915, he was no longer a revolutionary leader on the verge of victory, but a regional guerrilla leader fighting for survival. The United States' decision in October 1915 to recognize Carranza's government as Mexico's legitimate government was the final blow to Villa's political prospects. This recognition meant that Carranza could import weapons and ammunition from the United States, while Villa could not. It meant American banks would lend to Carranza, but not to Villa. It meant that in any future conflict between the two revolutionary leaders, the United States would support Carranza diplomatically and potentially militarily. Villa, who'd courted American support carefully, who'd protected American properties, who'd given interviews to American journalists and signed contracts with American film companies, discovered that American support had been purely pragmatic and now was withdrawn entirely. Villa felt betrayed. From his perspective, he'd been a reliable friend to the United States, while Carranza had been distant and sometimes hostile to American interests. The shift seemed inexplicable, except as American preference for educated, conventionally bourgeois revolutionaries over peasant leaders, regardless of who'd actually been more cooperative. This perception wasn't entirely wrong. American officials did find Carranza more comprehensible and respectable than Villa, despite Villa's friendlier behavior. But it also reflected Villa's limited understanding of international politics and American strategic calculations. The emotional impact of this betrayal shouldn't be underestimated. Villa was an emotional, intense personality who felt personal loyalty deeply and expected it reciprocally. The American abandonment wasn't just a political setback, but a personal wound. Combined with his military defeats and deteriorating position in Mexican revolutionary politics, it created a psychological crisis that helps explain the otherwise inexplicable decision to attack Columbus, New Mexico, in March 1916. Different explanations for the Columbus raid have been proposed. Some historians emphasize practical motivations. Columbus had weapons and supplies that Villa's forces desperately needed, and capturing them through a raid was simpler than buying them through smuggling networks that American authorities were increasingly monitoring. Others emphasize revenge. Villa wanted to punish the United States for withdrawing support and backing Carranza, wanted to demonstrate that he remained dangerous even in defeat, wanted to force the United States to take him seriously again. Still others suggest strategic calculation. Perhaps Villa believed that provoking American military intervention into Mexico would undermine Carranza by making him appear subservient to foreign powers. Probably all these motivations operated simultaneously. Villa needed supplies. He wanted revenge. He hoped to gain strategic advantages by complicating Carranza's relationship with the United States. The raid was simultaneously practical, emotional, and strategic, which perhaps explains why it was both tactically successful in its immediate objectives and strategically catastrophic in its longer-term consequences. The raid itself happened before dawn on March 9, 1916. Several hundred of Villa's men crossed the border, rode into Columbus, a small border town with a US Army garrison, and attacked. They burned buildings, took supplies, fought with American soldiers who'd been surprised but quickly organized resistance. The fighting lasted a few hours before Villa's forces withdrew back across the border. American casualties were about 18 dead, both soldiers and civilians, while Villa's forces lost perhaps 60 to 70 men, though exact numbers remain disputed. This was the first hostile attack on United States territory in the 20th century, and American public reaction was explosive. Newspapers demanded retaliation. President Woodrow Wilson, who'd already intervened in Mexican affairs multiple times, authorized a punitive expedition to capture Villa and disperse his forces. Brigadier General John J. Pershing, who would later command American forces in World War I, was ordered to lead approximately 10,000 troops into Mexico to hunt Villa down. The Columbus raid achieved Villa's immediate tactical goals. His forces captured weapons, ammunition, horses, and supplies. But it destroyed whatever remained of his political legitimacy and international support. The raid made him appear not as a revolutionary leader, but as a bandit and terrorist who attacked civilian targets. It shifted American policy from neutral recognition of Carranza to active cooperation against Villa. It gave Carranza an opportunity to position himself as the Mexican leader protecting sovereignty against American intervention that Villa had provoked. Strategically, it was probably the worst decision of Villa's career. Why did Villa make such a catastrophic choice? Perhaps because by March 1916, he had no good options. His military defeats had eliminated prospects of winning Mexico's revolutionary civil war through conventional means. His political isolation meant he couldn't negotiate favorable terms with Carranza. His forces were diminishing as soldiers deserted or were captured. He faced the choice between accepting complete defeat, surrendering or fleeing into permanent exile, or making dramatic gestures that might somehow change his fortunes, even at enormous risk. The Columbus raid was that desperate gamble, a decision that made sense only if Villa believed he had nothing left to lose. We should also consider the raid in context of borderlands violence that was common during this period. The United States-Mexico border wasn't a peaceful line, but a zone of frequent conflict where revolutionaries, bandits, smugglers, and various military forces operated with limited respect for international boundaries. American forces had intervened in Mexico multiple times, including occupying Veracruz in 1914. Mexican revolutionaries had conducted cross-border operations for supplies and sanctuary regularly. Villa's raid was larger and more dramatic than typical border incidents, but wasn't completely unprecedented. This doesn't justify attacking civilians or American territory, but it suggests the raid wasn't as aberrational as American outrage portrayed it. It was an escalation of borderlands conflict that had been ongoing for years. The raid also revealed Villa's limitations as a strategic thinker. Tactically, he could be brilliant. His cavalry operations, his use of railroads, his ability to move forces quickly and strike unexpectedly demonstrated real military talent. But strategically, he made severe miscalculations, and Columbus was the worst. He apparently didn't anticipate how dramatically American public opinion would turn against him, or how the raid would undermine his image internationally, or how Carranza would benefit from American intervention that Villa had provoked. A more sophisticated political mind might have foreseen these consequences and chosen differently. But Villa, despite his intelligence and tactical abilities, lacked that broader strategic vision. The Columbus raid marks a turning point not just in Villa's career, but in how history would remember him. Before Columbus, he could be portrayed as a revolutionary hero, someone fighting for social justice, even if his methods were violent. After Columbus, he became permanently tainted as someone who'd attacked civilians and violated international norms. The raid guaranteed that whatever else Villa accomplished, whatever genuine revolutionary commitments he demonstrated, history would also remember him as the man who attacked American territory, provoking retaliation that would humiliate him even further. The Centaur of the North was about to be hunted by 10,000 American soldiers through Mexican mountains. That humiliation would, remarkably, enhance rather than destroy his legend, but not in ways Villa could have anticipated or probably wanted. March 1916 to February 1917. For 11 months, approximately 10,000 United States Army soldiers under General John J. Pershing pursued Pancho Villa through northern Mexico in what became known as the Punitive Expedition or the Pershing Expedition. This campaign was simultaneously a military operation, a diplomatic crisis, a technological showcase, and a massive embarrassment for the United States. Despite overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and resources, American forces never captured Villa, never significantly disrupted his operations, and eventually withdrew, having accomplished almost nothing while nearly provoking war with Carranza's Mexican government. Understanding why this expedition failed so completely teaches us about irregular warfare, nationalism, the limits of military power, and the resilience that made Villa legendary even in defeat. The American advantages seemed overwhelming. Pershing commanded 10,000 well-trained soldiers with modern weapons, artillery, machine guns, and support infrastructure. The expedition included unprecedented military technology for its time: airplanes for reconnaissance, the first use of aircraft in American military operations, motorized vehicles for transportation, and field radios for communication. American intelligence services operated throughout northern Mexico, gathering information about Villa's movements. The US government spent millions of dollars on the expedition, far more than Villa's entire revolutionary budget. Against all this, Villa had at most a few hundred fighters, mostly irregulars with whatever weapons they'd captured or smuggled, operating in terrain they knew, but with no external support and limited supplies. Yet Villa evaded capture completely. Pershing's forces penetrated hundreds of miles into Mexico, fought several skirmishes with Villa's men and with Carranza's forces, who resented American presence, established supply lines and communication networks, conducted systematic searches of regions where Villa was reported to be hiding. They never caught him. They never came particularly close. Villa moved through northern Mexico like a ghost, appearing in one place, disappearing before American forces arrived, showing up elsewhere days later, hundreds of miles away, continuing to conduct his own operations while being hunted by a modern army. How did Villa accomplish this remarkable feat? First, he understood the terrain intimately from years as outlaw and revolutionary. He knew where water sources were, which routes were passable, where to hide during day and move at night, how to survive in mountains and deserts that defeated less experienced pursuers. Second, he had support from Mexican civilian populations who hated American military intervention, regardless of their opinions about Villa himself. The Pershing expedition violated Mexican sovereignty, appeared to many Mexicans as Yankee imperialism, and triggered nationalistic resistance even among people who'd opposed Villa previously. Peasants warned Villa about American troop movements, provided supplies, hid his men, and gave American forces false information deliberately. Third, Villa's force was small enough to move quickly and live off limited resources, while American forces required elaborate supply chains that limited their mobility. The expedition also revealed technological limitations that tempered American confidence in military superiority. The airplanes, while innovative, were primitive by later standards, fragile, unreliable, with limited range and payload capacity. They crashed frequently in Mexico's challenging terrain and weather. Motorized vehicles broke down on rough roads or couldn't travel off-road at all. Communications remained difficult, despite radios, because Mexico's distances and terrain limited signal ranges. American soldiers, most from East Coast and Midwest regions, struggled with Mexico's climate, desert conditions, and unfamiliar diseases. The technological advantages that should have made the expedition overwhelming proved less decisive than planners anticipated. Diplomatic complications further constrained American operations. Carranza's government had reluctantly permitted American pursuit of Villa, but only under strict conditions. American forces couldn't use Mexican railroads, couldn't occupy Mexican towns, had to avoid contact with Mexican federal forces, and were expected to withdraw once Villa was captured. As the expedition dragged on without success, Carranza became increasingly hostile to continued American presence. Mexican nationalism demanded that American forces leave regardless of whether Villa had been captured. By mid-1916, tensions between American and Mexican forces were escalating toward potential warfare between the two governments. The situation came to crisis in June 1916 at Parral, where American and Mexican forces fought a significant engagement. American troops seeking to pass through the area were confronted by Mexican federal forces ordered to prevent American movement. Shooting began, accounts disagree about who fired first, and the battle resulted in casualties on both sides, with some American soldiers captured. This confrontation created genuine risk of full-scale war between the United States and Mexico, which neither government actually wanted, but which seemed increasingly possible if the expedition continued. President Wilson faced difficult choices. Withdrawing the expedition without capturing Villa would look like failure and embarrass his administration. Continuing risked war with Mexico, which would be politically costly and strategically foolish, given growing concerns about European warfare that might eventually involve the United States. Wilson chose a middle path. The expedition would continue, but with reduced scope and without further provocations to Mexican forces. By late 1916, the expedition had effectively stopped trying to capture Villa and was just maintaining presence in northern Mexico, while diplomats negotiated terms for withdrawal. For Villa, the expedition was simultaneously a crisis and an opportunity. On one hand, being hunted by American forces demonstrated his reduced circumstances. The powerful revolutionary leader of 1914 was now a fugitive, unable even to operate freely in his own region. On the other hand, American failure to capture him enhanced his legendary status. The fact that 10,000 American soldiers couldn't find him, that the mighty United States couldn't defeat one Mexican guerrilla leader, proved Villa's extraordinary capabilities and humiliated American power. Mexican nationalists who'd opposed Villa before began reconsidering their opinions. Anyone who could frustrate Yankee imperialism so effectively deserved respect, regardless of his politics. Villa also continued his own military operations during the expedition. He attacked Mexican government forces, raided towns that supported Carranza, executed enemies, and demonstrated that he remained dangerous despite being hunted. In September 1916, Villa personally led an attack on Chihuahua City, one of northern Mexico's largest cities, showing audacious courage and tactical ability. Though he couldn't hold the city against superior forces, the attack demonstrated he wasn't finished as a military threat. The expedition meant to eliminate Villa had instead proven his resilience. By February 1917, the expedition was clearly failing, and diplomatic pressure for withdrawal was overwhelming. The United States was moving toward involvement in World War I, making Mexican entanglements increasingly problematic. Carranza's government was threatening to break diplomatic relations if American troops didn't leave. And there was simply no prospect of capturing Villa. He'd evaded pursuit for 11 months, and another 11 months wouldn't change the outcome. Wilson ordered withdrawal. The expedition ended officially in February 1917, with Pershing's forces returning to the United States, having accomplished none of their stated objectives. The expedition's failure taught important lessons about irregular warfare that would be relevant throughout the 20th century and beyond. Superior technology and resources don't guarantee victory when fighting enemies who know terrain intimately, who have popular support, who employ guerrilla tactics, and who can blend into civilian populations. Hunting individual leaders is extraordinarily difficult when those leaders are mobile, cautious, and protected by supporters. Intervening militarily in another country creates nationalist resistance that often helps the very enemies you're trying to defeat. These lessons learned painfully in Mexico during 1916 to 1917 would be relearned in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts where conventional military superiority proved insufficient for victory. For Pancho Villa personally, surviving the Pershing expedition was perhaps his greatest achievement after his early revolutionary victories. He'd been defeated militarily by Obregón, abandoned politically by former allies and international supporters, hunted by the most powerful military in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, he survived, continued fighting, maintained his dignity and his legend. The boy from the hacienda, the outlaw from the mountains, had proven himself more than just a fighter. He'd proven himself an enduring symbol that couldn't be eliminated simply by deploying superior force against him. But survival wasn't victory. By 1917, Villa controlled almost no territory, commanded few fighters compared to his peak strength, had no realistic prospect of achieving political power, and faced an indefinite future of guerrilla warfare against a Mexican government growing stronger. The expedition's end didn't end Villa's war. It just returned that war to being an internal Mexican conflict without American involvement. Villa would fight on for several more years, but increasingly it became clear that he was fighting from necessity and pride, rather than from any genuine hope of victory. The Centaur of the North was trapped in a war he couldn't win, but also couldn't afford to lose. That impossible situation would eventually lead him to seek the peace that he'd avoided for so long. By 1920, Pancho Villa was exhausted. He'd been fighting almost continuously for a decade, against Diaz, against Huerta, against Carranza, against American forces, against Mexican federal troops. He'd won spectacular victories and suffered devastating defeats. He'd commanded tens of thousands of soldiers and been reduced to leading small guerrilla bands. He'd been celebrated internationally and hunted desperately. He was 42 years old, but probably felt much older, worn down by violence, betrayals, and the recognition that he would never achieve the revolutionary transformation of Mexico he'd fought for. The time had come, finally, for peace. The context that made peace possible was political change in Mexico City. Venustiano Carranza, whose government Villa had fought since 1914, was overthrown and killed in May 1920 by Álvaro Obregón and other revolutionary generals who'd grown frustrated with Carranza's authoritarian tendencies and political manipulation. Obregón became president through elections in late 1920, and he approached Mexico's continuing civil conflicts pragmatically. He recognized that military victory over Villa was possible but costly, that Villa's continuing resistance drained resources and prevented stability, and that negotiated peace might be preferable to prolonged conflict. For Villa, Obregón's presidency created opportunities. Villa respected Obregón as a military commander, even though Obregón had defeated him at Celaya and subsequent battles. Obregón had demonstrated that he understood warfare and respected capable opponents. Unlike Carranza, who Via hated personally and considered a traitor to revolutionary ideals, Obregon seemed like someone Villa could negotiate with honorably. Moreover, Villa was genuinely tired of fighting. He'd lost so many men, seen so much violence, achieved so little despite enormous effort. The prospect of retirement, of living peacefully, of escaping the constant danger and stress of guerrilla warfare became increasingly attractive. Negotiations occurred through intermediaries during late 1920. The government offered Villa terms. He would receive a hacienda Canutillo in Durango state, with sufficient land to support himself and 50 of his former soldiers who would become agricultural workers. He would receive a military pension acknowledging his service to the revolution. In exchange, he would retire from military activity, cease opposition to the government, and essentially disappear from political life. Villa found these terms acceptable. He'd get land, something he'd fought for throughout his revolutionary career, and could live peacefully with his men, farming and raising livestock. It wasn't victory, but it was dignified survival. The formal agreement was signed in July 1920. Villa surrendered his weapons, disbanded his remaining forces except those 50 men who would accompany him to Canutillo, and pledged to accept government authority. Obregon's government proclaimed the peace treaty publicly, celebrating it as ending one of the revolution's longest conflicts. Villa traveled to Canutillo and began what he probably hoped would be a quiet retirement from the violence that had defined his adult life. Hacienda Canutillo became Villa's social experiment. He distributed some land to his former soldiers as private plots, but managed much of the hacienda communally, with shared labor and collective decision-making. This arrangement reflected both practical necessity. Managing a large estate required coordinated effort, and Villa's vision of what revolutionary land reform should accomplish. He wasn't trying to recreate the old hacienda system, where a wealthy owner exploited workers, but to create an agricultural community where former soldiers could live with dignity and relative equality. Villa also continued his commitment to education. He established a school at Canutillo for workers' children and for children from surrounding communities. He funded teachers' salaries and provided supplies, ensuring that the next generation would have educational opportunities he'd been denied. This attention to education wasn't just abstract idealism. Villa genuinely believed that literacy and basic education were essential for people to improve their conditions and resist future exploitation. The school at Canutillo was his small contribution toward that goal. He lived relatively simply, despite having sufficient resources to be comfortable. He maintained discipline and routine, rising early to oversee agricultural work, meeting with workers to discuss operations, handling estate management personally rather than delegating to administrators. He wasn't pretending to be a peasant. He was the estate's owner with authority over operations. But he also wasn't living in luxury or creating the kind of social distance between himself and workers that had characterized the old hacienda system he'd fought against. But retirement didn't bring complete peace. Villa remained politically controversial and personally dangerous to powerful interests. Some of Obregon's supporters worried that Villa might return to military activity if circumstances changed or if he became dissatisfied with civilian life. Wealthy landowners whose property Villa had expropriated during the revolution wanted revenge. Political rivals worried that Villa might support opposition candidates in future elections or might provide symbolic leadership to continuing revolutionary movements. The fact that Villa was living peacefully didn't eliminate these concerns, because Villa's history and legendary status made him perpetually threatening to established order. There were also personal enemies, people who blamed Villa for specific acts during the revolution, families who'd lost members to Villa's forces, individuals who'd been targeted during his governorship or military campaigns. Mexican revolutionary violence had created thousands of personal grievances, and while the revolution had officially ended, those grievances remained alive in people who'd been harmed. Villa, living openly at Canutillo, was vulnerable in ways that Villa, the guerrilla leader, hiding in mountains, had never been. Peace made him safer from government forces, but more vulnerable to private vengeance. Throughout 1921, 1922, and early 1923, Villa maintained his peaceful retirement, but also remained politically engaged. He gave interviews to journalists, commenting on Mexican politics and criticizing government policies he disagreed with. He corresponded with former revolutionary colleagues, maintaining relationships that worried authorities because they suggested Villa might retain ability to mobilize support if he chose. He lived within the terms of his peace agreement, but pushed at its boundaries, remaining visible and politically relevant rather than disappearing completely into private life. This visibility concerned Obregon's government and various other interests who preferred Villa to be completely removed from political relevance. Some historians believe Obregon personally ordered Villa's assassination, while others argue that regional political figures and wealthy landowners organized it independently. The exact conspiracy remains disputed, but what's clear is that by mid-1923, powerful people had decided Villa needed to be eliminated, despite the peace treaty that supposedly protected him. July 20, 1923. Villa was in Parral, a town in Chihuahua State, handling business matters. He was traveling in his Dodge touring car, driving himself with several companions as passengers. As the car approached an intersection, a street vendor, positioned there deliberately as a lookout, raised his hand signaling Villa's approach. 9 assassins hidden in a nearby building opened fire with rifles, firing approximately 40 shots into the vehicle. Villa was hit multiple times and died almost immediately. Several companions were also wounded or killed in the ambush. The assassination was efficiently planned and executed. The location was chosen because Villa had to slow down for the intersection. The number of assassins ensured overwhelming firepower. The coordination with the street vendor signaled careful preparation. Villa, despite his legendary awareness of danger and survival instincts, had no chance to escape or defend himself. The ambush succeeded completely, eliminating one of Mexico's most famous revolutionaries in seconds of violence. Public reaction was mixed. Villa's supporters mourned genuinely. They'd lost a hero, someone who'd fought for them, someone whose legend represented hope that poor Mexicans could resist oppression. Many Mexicans who weren't particularly pro-Villa still recognized his historical importance and felt that assassinating him after he'd accepted peace was dishonorable. But Villa's enemies celebrated, or at least felt relief. A dangerous, unpredictable figure was finally gone, eliminated before he could cause further disruptions. And the government, whether or not it had ordered the assassination, benefited from Villa's removal because it eliminated lingering concerns about his potential return to military or political activity. Villa was buried in Parral initially, but the story didn't end with burial. In 1926, someone broke into his tomb and stole his head. To this day, nobody knows definitively who took it or why. Theories include trophy collectors, American curiosity seekers, political enemies wanting to desecrate his memory, even suggestions that someone wanted to study his brain to understand his military genius or revolutionary commitment. The missing head became part of Villa's legend. Even in death, he remained mysterious, incomplete, resistant to simple conclusions. The assassination ended Pancho Villa's life, but couldn't contain his legend. Because Villa had become something larger than one man, had transformed into symbol and myth, the physical elimination of his body didn't eliminate what he represented. His story, already legendary before his death, became even more mythologized afterward. And that legend, what it means, why it persists, what it teaches us about revolution, violence, justice, and Mexican history, is what we need to understand in our final episode. Pancho Villa died in 1923, but his legend lives on a century later, in corridos sung throughout Mexico and the American Southwest, in films and books and murals, in political rhetoric invoking his name, in historical debates about his character and significance. Understanding why this legend endures, what it represents, and what it teaches us about revolution, violence, justice, and memory is essential for understanding not just Villa himself, but also how societies create heroes to meet their psychological and political needs. Villa's transformation from person to symbol, from historical figure to enduring myth, reveals truths about both Mexican history and about the universal human need for stories that give meaning to suffering and hope to the oppressed. Let's start with the most basic question. Why does Villa remain famous when most revolutionary leaders from the same period are forgotten except by specialists? The Mexican Revolution produced dozens of significant military commanders, hundreds of political leaders, thousands of intellectuals and organizers who contributed to revolutionary movements. Most are now known only to historians. Villa remains a household name, not just in Mexico, but internationally. This enduring fame requires explanation beyond just saying Villa was important historically. Many important people are forgotten, while less consequential figures become legendary. What made Villa's story especially compelling? First, Villa's life story has dramatic elements that lend themselves to mythologization. The progression from poor farm worker to outlaw, to revolutionary general, to governor, to defeated guerrilla, to peaceful retiree, to assassination victim, creates a narrative arc rivaling any fiction. The contrasts within his character, brutal warrior but champion of the poor, illiterate but intelligent, personally generous but politically ruthless, celebrated internationally but ultimately defeated, create complexity that keeps audiences interested. The mysteries surrounding him. Did he really do everything attributed to him? What were his true motivations? Who ordered his assassination? Where is his head? Maintain fascination across generations. Second, Villa represents themes that remain politically and emotionally resonant. The story of poor people rising against wealthy oppressors, of ordinary individuals challenging unjust systems, of courage and resistance against overwhelming power. These are universal themes that transcend Villa's specific historical context. Every society has oppressed populations who need heroes representing their struggles. Villa's legend serves that function for Mexican Americans, for poor people throughout Latin America, for anyone who identifies with resistance against injustice. The legend adapts to different contexts while maintaining its core message, that ordinary people can fight back, that the powerful aren't invincible, that justice is possible even when the system denies it. Third, Villa's legend benefits from ambiguity. We don't know definitively whether he was hero or villain because evidence supports both interpretations. He fought for land reform and education, but also conducted brutal military campaigns. He protected some civilians, but ordered execution of others. He maintained personal honor codes, but also violated norms when convenient. This ambiguity makes Villa's legend flexible. Different people can emphasize different aspects, can claim Villa for different political purposes, can debate his legacy endlessly without reaching definitive conclusions. Legends thrive on such ambiguity because it allows continuous reinterpretation. The corridos, traditional ballads celebrating Villa, have been crucial for maintaining his legend across generations. These songs, passed down orally and later recorded, tell Villa's story in accessible form for audiences who might not read historical texts. They emphasize his bravery, his commitment to poor people, his battles against injustice. They minimize or ignore his defeats and controversial actions, creating simplified, heroic narratives. Corridos aren't historically accurate in academic sense, but they serve the crucial cultural function of keeping Villa's memory alive in communities that claim him as their hero. Villa's relationship with the United States contributes significantly to his enduring legend. The Columbus raid and the Pershing expedition created dramatic confrontation between Villa and American power. For Mexican nationalists, Villa humiliating the United States by evading capture during the expedition represents resistance against Yankee imperialism. For Americans, Villa represents the dangerous, unpredictable nature of Mexican politics and the challenges of military intervention. For Mexican Americans, Villa embodies the complicated relationship between Mexican and American identities, between resistance and accommodation, between pride in Mexican heritage and life in American society. The political uses of Villa's legend reveal its power and flexibility. Mexican governments, despite often opposing Villa during his lifetime, later claimed him as revolutionary hero, incorporating him into official nationalism. Leftist movements throughout Latin America invoke Villa as symbol of peasant resistance against capitalism and imperialism. Conservative nationalists emphasize Villa's defense of Mexican sovereignty against American intervention. Each group selects aspects of Villa's complex legacy that support their political goals while downplaying contradictory elements. This appropriation for very political purposes demonstrates the legend's malleability and enduring relevance. Academic historical work on Villa has been extensive but hasn't settled debates about his significance. Historians argue about how much of Villa's story is documented fact versus embellished legend, about whether his military campaigns were strategically intelligent or tactically lucky but ultimately doomed, about whether his social reforms were genuine commitments or political calculations, about whether he should be celebrated as hero or condemned as bandit. These scholarly debates probably won't ever reach consensus because evidence is incomplete and because interpreting that evidence requires judgments about values that historians don't share universally. The question of Villa's literacy, whether he was completely illiterate, barely literate, or more educated than generally believed, symbolizes broader debates about his character. If Villa was entirely illiterate, it emphasizes his rise from absolute disadvantage and suggests his intelligence was purely practical and intuitive. If he had some education, it complicates simple narratives about the uneducated peasant warrior. Evidence suggests Villa had minimal literacy, could read simple texts with difficulty, could sign his name sometimes, but certainly wasn't educated in formal sense. This minimal literacy didn't prevent him from understanding politics, conducting diplomacy, making strategic decisions, or commanding armies effectively. His example demonstrates that intelligence and capability aren't synonymous with formal education, though education clearly would have helped him. Villa's treatment of women and his personal relationships raise uncomfortable questions that his legend sometimes obscures. By various accounts, Villa married or had relationships with multiple women. Some sources claim dozens of wives or partners. Whether these were legitimate marriages, informal partnerships, or something else, depends on how we interpret evidence and what standards we apply. Villa lived in a culture where powerful men having multiple partners was common and where women's agency was limited. He wasn't unique in having multiple relationships, but neither does his participation in that cultural pattern reflect well on him by modern standards. His legend typically downplays or romanticizes these aspects of his life, presenting him as passionate rather than examining possible exploitation. The theft of Villa's head from his tomb in 1926 adds macabre mystery that enhances his legend. Theories about who took it and why proliferate. American trophy hunters, Mexican political enemies, scientific researchers, even suggestions of occult motivations. No definitive answer has emerged, despite decades of speculation and investigation. The missing head parallels the head of Joaquin Murrieta, displayed in California. Both Mexican revolutionary figures decapitated, both heads becoming objects of fascination and mystery, both disappearing into historical ambiguity. This pattern suggests something about how societies treat revolutionary heroes' bodies, simultaneously revering and violating them, unable to let them rest peacefully, even in death. Modern visits to Villa's final resting place. His body was moved to Mexico City and interred in the monument to the revolution, reveal continued fascination with him. Tourists visit, Mexican citizens pay respects, scholars research, filmmakers document. Villa remains present in Mexican cultural consciousness in ways that most historical figures don't. Streets, schools, towns bear his name throughout northern Mexico and the Mexican-American Southwest. Statues commemorate him. Anniversaries of major events in his life are marked publicly. The Mexican government, while complex and sometimes critical in its historical assessment, has incorporated Villa into official revolutionary pantheon alongside other leaders. What should we conclude about Pancho Villa? Perhaps that he was simultaneously a bandit and a revolutionary, a hero and a war criminal, a brilliant tactician and a strategic failure, a champion of the poor and a violent authoritarian. All of these at once because real human beings contain contradictions that simple narratives can't capture. Villa fought genuine injustices using methods that sometimes created new injustices. He helped poor people while also harming them through warfare's inevitable collateral damage. He challenged oppressive systems while also maintaining hierarchies within his own organizations. He was both better and worse than his legend portrays, more human, more complicated, less suitable for simple moral judgments. The most important lesson from Villa's life and legend may be about revolution itself. Villa believed that revolutionary violence could transform Mexican society, could break the power of wealthy elites, could redistribute land and create justice for poor people. He fought for that transformation with extraordinary courage and determination. The revolution did produce significant changes. Mexico after the revolution was different from Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship in important ways. But it didn't produce the fundamental transformation Villa fought for. Land redistribution happened incompletely. Poverty persisted. New elites replaced old ones. The fundamental structures of inequality that had driven Villa into outlawry and revolution remained largely intact despite a decade of revolutionary warfare. This doesn't mean Villa's fight was meaningless. The Mexican Revolution produced the modern Mexican state with all its flaws and achievements. Villa's military campaigns contributed significantly to destroying the Diaz dictatorship and the old hacienda system. His brief governorship demonstrated that revolutionary promises could translate into actual policy, even if circumstances prevented sustaining those policies. His legend provided inspiration for subsequent movements seeking social justice throughout Latin America. But it does mean that revolution's promise of complete transformation remains unfulfilled, that the gap between revolutionary ideals and post-revolutionary reality creates disappointment even in partially successful revolutions. Villa's story also teaches about the relationship between violence and justice. Villa used extreme violence, pursuing what he believed were just goals. Was that violence justified? From his perspective, absolutely. The hacienda system's violence against poor Mexicans justified revolutionary violence to destroy that system. From his victim's perspective, certainly not. Being executed or having property seized isn't justified, regardless of broader political context. This moral complexity doesn't resolve easily. We can simultaneously recognize that Villa fought genuine injustices and acknowledge that his methods created unjustifiable suffering. Both things can be true at once. The centaur of the North rides through Mexican history and imagination still, a century after his death. His legend is immortal because it addresses truths that remain relevant, that injustice produces resistance, that ordinary people can challenge powerful systems, that courage and determination matter even when they don't guarantee success, that revolution's promise always exceeds its achievement, but pursuing that promise remains necessary regardless. As long as people face oppression, as long as societies contain fundamental inequalities, as long as hope for transformation persists despite repeated disappointments, Pancho Villa's legend will endure. He represents not what was or what is, but what might be. The possibility that someday, somewhere, revolutionary promises of justice for all people might actually be fulfilled. That possibility, however distant, is worth remembering. And Pancho Villa, whatever his flaws and failures, devoted his life to that possibility. That devotion, ultimately, is why his legend lives.